Hi everybody, so I had a question about why a drug like cocaine is an agonist. And the reason that can be kind of confusing is just the wording, unfortunately. So remember, agonists and antagonists are words that describe the action of a drug on a neurotransmitter or the receptors for that neurotransmitter. So an agonist is a drug that increases the neurotransmitter that's released. So it's going to increase the levels of those neurotransmitters by like releasing more of it. It could stimulate the receptors of that neurotransmitter as if it was the same as the neurotransmitter. So it's like mimicking it. So we see that. It could also provide the needed ingredients for the synthesis of the neurotransmitter. But another way that it works, in addition to all of these, where these are more intuitive because it's leading to more neurotransmitter, an additional one is it can block, in other words, prevent or decrease the reuptake of the neurotransmitter. And unfortunately, this is where the wording gets difficult because we see block or prevent, and it makes it seem like it's different than an agonist. So I'm going to show you in a minute why blocking or preventing or decreasing the reuptake of a neurotransmitter makes a drug an agonist. And then briefly, like a drug that's an antagonist is basically going to do the opposite of these things. It's going to decrease levels of the neurotransmitter. It is going to prevent the release of the neurotransmitter. It's going to block the receptors so they cannot be stimulated. So it's not going to activate those receptors at all. It's not going to stimulate them, but it's going to block the receptors so they cannot be stimulated, kind of like gumming them up and preventing any neurotransmitter that's there from going in. And it can also lead to the destruction of the neurotransmitter before it's released. By having it leak from the vesicles, so that it gets destroyed by these enzymes. All right, so an agonist, it's as if there's more neurotransmitter. Antagonist, as if there's less neurotransmitter. So let's take a look and see why blocking reuptake makes something an agonist. So we have our synapse here. We have our presynaptic neuron. And we have our postsynaptic neuron. So this is a dendrite. And this is the axon terminal. And here are our vesicles. Here's the neurotransmitter inside. Here on this side, on the postsynaptic side, we have the receptors for that neurotransmitter. Our action potential travels down the synapse. It's going to make calcium come on in. That calcium is going to move these vesicles towards the cell membrane here, and that's going to lead to a release of the neurotransmitter. So here we see the neurotransmitter has been released. Now it can go in and it can bind to these receptors, but once the receptor uses that neurotransmitter, there'll be space then again for new neurotransmitter, this next one for example, to keep flowing in and binding until there's just no more left in the synapse. But what happens is that there's actually a mechanism here, because there's something called an autoreceptor, which when the neurotransmitter comes around and sort of floats around here and binds here to this autoreceptor, it's going to tell the neuron, hey, you've released enough. And so what happens then? Once the autoreceptor has been stimulated, then there are these two main ways that this neurotransmitter that's sitting out here gets brought back in. And so we see that one way is through this process called reuptake, where it gets brought back in, repackaged into the vesicles. And that means it'll get used later. But for now, it's being sucked out of the synapse. The other way it's done, it's very similar, but it's broken down. So that's called enzymatic degradation. It gets broken down into its basic ingredients, and then the neuron makes new neurotransmitter out of these ingredients. But again, in both cases, this process of bringing that neurotransmitter back in and either reuptaking it or enzymatic degradation sucks it out of there, so it's going to remove it. Now, if you have a drug that is blocking this reuptake, you're preventing this process. You're leaving that neurotransmitter in the synapse longer, and so it can continue to act and stimulate these receptors. And so that's why a drug that blocks reuptake, like cocaine, is going to be an agonist, in this case for dopamine.